Hi there YouTube, this is the Magnus bringing you another Total War Warhammer video, and this is going to be part 1 of a competitive multiplayer guide, and we're going to cover army composition and army building today. So I've got 10 guidelines for you to follow that I think are going to help you do better on the ladder, do better in tournaments or any sort of competitive play, whether it's against your friends or online. Now, number 1 is build your armies before you queue up for a match. That may, for a lot of you, sound like common sense, but you'd be surprised how many people actually put their build together while they're in the lobby after they've gotten an opponent. And the problem with that is you really may only have 60 seconds to put your build together. And with all the things that you need to consider, 60 seconds is not enough to put a good army together, and there's no reason to rush yourself like that, because you can save builds and load them and go from there. So you'll see I have quite a few builds that I play with or I've been testing and things like that, and that's definitely going to give you an advantage in competitive play. Now that takes us to rule number 2, where you want to have a different build for each potential opponent. Every single army that you can face, from dwarfs to chaos to greenskins, have very different strengths and weaknesses and different things that you need to consider. So you're going to want to have a build that takes that into account. Now you can either do that the way I do it, which is have builds for virtually every single situation already preloaded, or at least you want to have a general build that you want to use and then modify it when you get a match to adapt to your opponent and his faction. So that way you're only making a few changes rather than trying to build an army from scratch. Because when you build an army from scratch, you're doing things like, let's say for example, we're going to take Karl Franz here. And we're just using the Empire because they have a lot of choices, so it's good for this video. But Karl Franz, you have to decide what mount you want him on, what abilities are you going to take, which ones are you going to leave, and what items you're going to take. All of these things merit consideration, and if you have to do all of that on the fly, you're going to end up taking abilities, spells, and units that aren't going to be useful to you. So definitely have some builds, or at least a general guideline of a build, before you go in to face different opponents. Number 3 is, there really are no hard and fast rules to army composition. You can do a lot of different things, and that's a big part of what makes this game so much fun and very challenging as far as the multiplayer scene. But there is one guideline that I really think you should follow at least 90% of the time, and that is with your infantry. Your infantry is truly the core of your army. They are going to take most of the beating, and they're the ones that are going to essentially protect your other units, or be a meat shield for them, or provide the framework for them to flank and do things like that. So that's establishing your line. And when you establish your line, I recommend having at least 6 infantry. Now whether you go cheap or expensive, a mix, or only 1 or 2 different kinds of units is all very situational. But if you have less than 6 infantry on the field, it's going to be very hard for you to assert yourself and for you to be able to protect the units that need protecting, and make sure you have enough men on the field to avoid things like chain routes or key units being surrounded. So have at least 6. I like to go up as high as 8 or 9. Any more than that, you're going to have some diminishing returns, just because it's going to be hard to get all of those infantry into position and then have them all have a significant target to attack. Now there are some factions and some builds where you will go higher, but 6 to 8 infantry is a nice good core to start from. Rule number 4, or guideline number 4, is you want to be involved in at least 2 theaters. And the theaters, as far as I label them, are infantry, cavalry, ranged, air, and magic. Ranged includes artillery and handgunners or crossbowmen or what have you. Now the idea here is, if you have, let's say, just infantry, you're going to be very limited in how you can deal damage. You might have a very strong line, but how are you going to get to key units? How are you going to get an advantage on the field? It's going to be very hard. So you want to participate in at least 2 theaters. Now, how many theaters you participate in is going to vary based on a number of things. Number 1 being your own micro skills. If you don't have the best micro, you're still working on that aspect of the game, stick to 2, maybe 3 theaters. Because if you've got spells to cast, you've got infantry, you've got cav running around, you've got ranged units you have to manage, including artillery, plus you have air units, I can almost guarantee that you're not going to use your army to great effect. You're not going to be cost effective and efficient, because a lot of times abilities are going to be on cooldown, they're going to come off cooldown, and you're not going to use them, which means you're not getting full value. Your shock cav, for example, will be stuck sitting there fighting instead of cycle charging, so they're not going to be nearly as good as you think they are, and so on and so forth. So limit your theaters based on the faction you're playing, the faction you're playing against, and also your own micro skills and preferences. Rule number 5, or guideline number 5, is know what your early and late game plays are. And what I mean by that is, early in the match, what is it that you want to do right away? Are you going to use some spell to try to spike one of their leaders down? Are you going to hide men in the forest and try to attack them? Do you have skirmishers that you're going to initiate the beginning of the battle with? Know what that early play is, and then also know what your late game plays are. And that's based on who is likely to survive to the late game. You do not want to build your late game around, for example, spearmen. They're not going to be there. Your late game around crossbowmen. They might be there, but there's a damn good chance they won't be, and you'll be in trouble. Probably the flagellant is the best example of this. He will not be around, unless your opponent avoids him because he doesn't want to waste any time killing a unit that sucks. Sorry, but I'm not a big fan of the flagellant. So you want to base it on the units that are going to be around late game. So you can say, for example, my great swords. They have very high armor, good health. Odds are they're going to stick around for quite a bit of time. So you can base your late game on them. Or cavalry that are strong that you're going to protect. Or, for example, heroes. If you're going to have 2 empire captains with potions up in the air, for example, you can be pretty sure if you micro them well, they're going to be there as part of your late game. So you definitely want to know what your early and late game are. Guideline number 6 is factor in your strengths and weaknesses. And this really is a twofold guideline. Number 1 is your strengths and weaknesses. That's you as a person and as a player. If you don't have good micro skills, like we mentioned before, don't participate in too many theaters. Don't have too many micro intensive units. Don't have too many control groups, because you're going to run into trouble. Whereas if you have great micro, then you can participate in more theaters, and you should. Or you can focus on certain ones. Like, for example, you might be great at getting your cav in and out of engagements, or working with flying units, or making sure you maximize the usability of your spells. If that's the case, focus on your strengths, play to them, but also know what your weaknesses are. Whether it's your micro, your composition, your attention span, whatever it might be. If you don't have a very long attention span, you want a rush army, right? If you know your opponent and you know he doesn't, you want to do the opposite and drag the battle out. And that's going to take us right into the second half of factoring in your strengths and weaknesses, and that's the strengths and the weaknesses of the faction you're playing. For example, if you're going to play Bretonnia, what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? Okay, well, your strengths are that you can play well in the flying game, right? Because of the king or the lord going up in the air. You can do the same thing with your paladins, and they're not cost effective, but if you need to dominate, you can always add a Pegasus Knight or 2 to do so. So you know flying is a strength of Bretonnia. The other strength is cavalry. They're quite good at that, and they have very cheap but usable peasant bowmen that make for good range. So those are some of the strengths. But what are the weaknesses if I'm playing as Bretonnia? Well, one is infantry. Both of my only 2 choices of infantry are anti-large and charge defense against all. One is armor piercing. But we don't have anything that's anti-infantry, or anything that's really even geared towards fighting infantry. Now, out of the 2, the men-at-arm polearm is better because of the armor piercing. At least against most infantry, that's going to help you out. But you don't have great head-up infantry versus infantry fighters. You need to know that, you need to be aware of it, and you need to build accordingly. And not only that, play and plan accordingly. Number 7 is factoring your opponent's strengths and weaknesses. So if we're going up against, say, the Beastmen, we know they don't have the best cav. They're fast, but they don't trade well with other cav. So we might want to focus heavily on cav, knowing we're going to have that advantage right out the gate. We know, for example, what units are popular with the Beastmen because of how strong they are and how cost effective they are. You're going to see Gorbals, so you need to be ready to deal with them. You're going to see Bestigor because it's really the only infantry they have that can hang in there for a good bit of time. So if they even have any sort of a late game or even a mid game in mind, they're almost going to have the Bestigor. We know Giants are popular. We know Minotaurs are relatively popular. We know Cygors are. What do all these units have in common? Well, 4 of them are large. So obviously, if we're playing against the Beastmen, we need to have some anti-large in our army. A good bit of it, and preferably with our main infantry line. We also know the Bestigor has very high armor, but the rest of his infantry will not. These guys have 15, 15, 15, 15, and yes, 15 again. So, if I'm going to play as, say, the Greenskins, right, I know against these guys, my Savage Orcs are going to be great, right? Because none of them have armor, and the Savage Orc is not good against armor, but he'll cut through infantry that don't have much armor, so I know he's going to be good for me. I know the Orc Biggin's going to be good because he's going to bring monsters, and they're bigger and harder, and they're going to put a hurting on him. And if I know he's going to bring a couple of Bestigors, well, then I know Black Orcs are a great choice because they will cut through his Bestigors. And they're going to have the armor piercing and the armor to hang in there with them. So you definitely want to factor in the strengths of your opponent's faction and its weaknesses. Know what he's not going to have. Okay, he's playing as the Beastmen. He's almost certainly not going to bring missiles, right? Because he only has one choice and they're not very good. So that's something you can factor in. And there's a number of things you can do so. And if you watch my faction review videos for multiplayer, you can get some ideas of what's good and bad for each faction. Number 8 is tempo. And what I mean by tempo is, if you have, let's say you're playing the Beastmen, since we're already on this page, and you decide to go with your Gore Herd because they do good damage, you're going to bring... let's say you're going to bring them and you're going to have a couple of Senegors because they're quick and you like that. Maybe you're going to bring a Chaos Spawn and you want to get some magic on the field, so you bring the Bray Shaman and Wild. Right, and let's just pretend we put a whole army together out of these guys. Now, the mistake that you could easily make is load this guy up on spells and items and whatnot and then go into the battle. Well, you're going to have a problem. You're going to have a tempo problem. These units are great for rushing. They're all fast. Speed of 42, speed of 85, speed of 37. Shaman's at 38. So he's going to be okay with your infantry, but if you want him to be able to maneuver around with your Senegors or your Chaos Spawn, you're going to be in trouble, right? Or if you had faster infantry in this instance, you'd be in trouble because he's not going to be able to keep pace with them. So let's say you went monster heavy and you took, let's put a couple of Minotaurs in there, right? And you put some more cavalry out there and you have a little bit of infantry, but really that's just a defensive play. You're not spending much money on them. Who do you want your Bray Shaman with? If he's going to be with the infantry, leave him as he is. But if you want him out there running with your big boys, you got to come back here and you're going to want to think about putting him on the chariot. And that's just one example. You don't want to take, for example, the vampire counts, and you're thinking, I'm going to rush, I'm going to go Karn Wraiths, I want to put in a couple Hex Wraiths, so I'm going to use the Ethereal mechanic. I love Crypt Horrors, they do great damage. Maybe I want to chuck in a Vargulf because I'm playing against the Beastmen, and I want to be able to completely own his Gorbals. So I start putting this army together, and then I'm like, well, I have a little bit of money left over at some point, and I decide to go with, so let's say we take this guy, and we have a little money left, and we're like, let's take some zombies. They're good meat shields. They are good meat shields. But what's the problem here? These guys have a speed of 45, speed of 84, 84, 50 here, and 80 there. So you're rushing, and you have a bunch of fast units. Now you're going to slow them all down with the zombies, which is bad, or you're going to leave your zombies behind and they're not going to do anything for you. So the zombie is not a good choice here. So you want to go out and find something else that has the kind of speed that's going to be able to keep up with the rest of your army. The other way that tempo can be an issue is if you have a bunch of early game plays, like you're gonna rush in, let's say, as the Warriors of Chaos, and you're gonna use death magic to go after a couple of its units or leaders, and you say, I'm gonna bring a bunch of Forsaken because I want to do a lot of damage, maybe a couple of guys with great weapons, and I'm gonna do some skirmishing, right? Now, not a standard build, but follow me, please. The problem with this is all early game, right? Are these Forsaken going to be on the field late game? Probably not. Maybe these two Chaos Warriors, but they're not going to get it done themselves. Your Skirmishers either run out of ammo or get killed. They're gone. Your Forsaken, they can take a beating, but not much of a beating. Gone. You're counting on death magic. Well, what happens when your winds of magic are gone and you got to wait 8 minutes to get another spell off? So suddenly you find yourself in a situation where you're spent early, and if you don't win that battle in the first couple minutes of the engagement, you don't have a chance in hell, right? But you can also make the other mistake and go all late game, and then sure, you'll be around, but you won't be around with much because you weren't able to provide that punch up front. Number 9, as far as my guidelines, is test, test, test. Now, do you need to do what I do and spend 15, 20 hours a week testing every unit against every unit? Absolutely not. But when you put an army together, a composition, a framework, or for against a certain faction, at least test it against the AI, right? So let's say I put together this chaos build for fighting Bretonnia. And I think this is good. I think it's good. I like what I see, and maybe some things I watched online tell me this is going to work. That's not enough to justify bringing it to battle, unless you want to very likely lose. So instead, go in and load up your own Bretonnia build. Don't use the default one, right? Because if we just go to Bretonnia and we hit auto-generate, it builds horrible armies. Have you ever seen anybody play with this? No. How about that? No. That? Probably not, right? So build your own armies based on what you're doing or what other people are doing. So we go in here and we say, okay, where's my Bretonnian army? Let's take a look here. I lost my place. Okay, so here's my Bretonnia army. Now I'm testing against something. Now this was obviously from a previous patch, but we can always go in and do something like this, and then, okay. So if I can't beat my own Bretonnia build being controlled by the crummy AI, you're not going to beat a player. You're just not, right? So the first thing is to see if you can beat the AI. But the other thing is, too, is, okay, maybe after playing a few times, you find out these Chaos Warriors just aren't getting very many kills, and that's what you were expecting them to do. Or they're not lasting as long, or maybe you're having trouble dealing with a certain situation or a certain unit. Modify the build, try again. Modify, try again. And do that until you feel pretty confident. And then you can either test it in multiplayer or against friends, or you can take it to the ladder and try it out in real competitive play. So make sure you test. Make sure you have at least a good idea of what your strengths and weaknesses are, and you know how to play your build. You're much better off playing a weaker build where you know the units and you know how to make them perform well than taking a great build that you saw online and not knowing the units well. Trust me, you'll get butchered and you'll be upset and you'll say, oh, that build sucks. The build doesn't suck, it just doesn't suit you, or you didn't test it, you didn't practice with it. So take the time to do that. And that brings us to my last guideline for this segment on army composition and army building, and that is constantly improve based on your testing. So we just talked about that a little bit. Test it, make adjustments. Test it, make adjustments. But you should be doing the same thing when you go out and play ladder battles or in a tournament. Go back, look at your replays, which is a great thing to do. But if you're not that keen on putting that much time in, at least at the end of the battle, look at the screen and say, okay, what performed well and what didn't perform well. And do it while it's still fresh in your mind, because the kills can be deceiving. Sometimes a unit only gets 15 kills, but one of them was a giant. Well, that's something you want to take into account. So just look it over and say, okay, what's doing well, what's not? What can I change? What would be better? What problems have I run into? So constantly improve, and you're going to find out that you have some builds that are going to get stronger and stronger the more you play, and your wins will start to snowball. When I first started off playing competitively, I'd win a few, lose one or two, win a few, lose one or two, and now often I go 8, 10, 15, 20, even 30 matches without a loss. And it's because I have so much confidence in my build, and I know I've tweaked it so many times, and I've faced a certain opponent or a certain faction several times, and I know what to do. So if you follow these 10 guidelines, I can virtually guarantee you will become a better ladder player, a better tournament player, or just competitive against your friends or your clan or your guild, what have you. So if you enjoyed this video, if you learned from it, please like, please subscribe, share it with your friends if you feel like they need the help. Look out for part 2 coming soon, and until then, this is the Magnus. Thanks and take care.